All right. Good evening. I actually forgot to record this when I taught the class earlier, but I'm going to record it again now so that it can be for anybody who missed it when we taught the class live. Tonight we're going to talk about the parable of the unforgiving servant as well as another parable. But this one is in Matthew chapter 18 in verses 21 through 35. And the context of it is, as we see in verse 21 and 22, "Then Peter came to him and said, 'Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?' Jesus said to him, 'I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry, and delivered him to the torturers, until he should pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you, if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses." All right, so in the context of forgiveness and how many times to forgive, Jesus is showing the difference between what God does for us and what we do for others. In this parable, you have the kingdom of heaven being like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents and could not pay. And that represents us as God's servants. We owe him more than we can ever pay. Anyone who has sinned against God can never pay for that. There's just no way that we can make up for what we have done against him. And the king ordered that the servant be sold along with his wife, children, and everything that he had. And God requires that we pay what we owe him. After all, we owe him. It's a debt, and it's right for him to require it to be paid. And when the servant begged, the master had compassion and forgave the debt. And because of what Jesus has done in dying to pay for the sins of those that will beg for mercy, essentially, who recognize their debt and come to him through Jesus, God has compassion on those who demonstrate this remorse and understanding that we truly owe him. In the parable, the forgiven servant then found another servant who owed him 100 denarii and demanded that he pay what he owed. And this is the idea of other people sinning against us, so they're indebted to us. We've been forgiven by God because we sinned against him, but there are other people who sin against us. And this fellow servant begged for time to pay. It's the idea of the one who sinned against this forgiven servant, acknowledging their debt. They recognize they've sinned. They recognize that they've caused a problem, that they owe him, and they ask for mercy. And the forgiven servant had his fellow servant thrown into prison until he paid. This is the idea of someone who's been forgiven by God refusing to forgive sin that's against himself. And when the master found out, he unforgave that forgiven servant. He had him delivered to the torturers until he paid. And God has anger toward those who have received his forgiveness, but then refuse to forgive others much less than what we owe God. All right, so this parable is a lot easier to understand than some of the other parables. You have forgiveness of sin compared with the forgiveness of debt, and that's easily comparable. We can understand if we've borrowed money from somebody, we actually owe them that money. If our debt's forgiven, we should be grateful because we're never entitled to having debt forgiven. It wouldn't be debt if we are entitled to having it forgiven. That wouldn't make sense. And so we should be grateful if our debt is forgiven. In the parable, the only one that acknowledges their sin or understands what they owe and asks for mercy is forgiven. And that's true of how God deals with sin. If we don't acknowledge our sin, God will not forgive us. And he does not expect us to forgive others who do not acknowledge their sin against us either. That does not mean that we are to be ugly to them, to hold grudges. We are to love our enemies. We are to be kind even to the unjust. We are to be good to others, just as God was good to everyone, to his enemies, when Jesus died for all. But forgiveness is a different matter. Forgiveness means that the debt is wiped clean, that it will be never brought up. And we are not supposed to do that for those that don't acknowledge their sin against us. We are to try to insist that they pay their debt, essentially, or at least acknowledge that they can't pay their debt, but they have a debt. Because otherwise, they've also sinned against God. If they don't acknowledge their sin against us, then how can they ever be forgiven? We can't just let it go. But it's important that if somebody does acknowledge their sin against us, that we're quick to forgive. God views the sins that they have done against us as far smaller than what we have done against him. And we should be so grateful at having been forgiven our sins against God that we should pass on that forgiveness to others that ask mercy from us. And so Jesus says, forgive 70 times 7, which is not a maximum number, just the idea as many times as you need to, because that's what God does for us. In fact, he's forgiven us far more than any number of times somebody might sin against us. All right. The other parable we're going to look at is the parable of the day laborers. And this is some men who are hired to work in a vineyard for a day, and they get paid at the end of the day. Well, in Matthew chapter 20, in verses 1 through 16, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now, when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the 3rd hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle and said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive.' So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first." And when those came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more, and they likewise received each a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, "These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them and said, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first last. For many are called, but few are chosen." In this parable, you have this landowner who went out early in the morning to hire the workers for his vineyard. That's like the kingdom of heaven is like that. So this is how the kingdom of heaven works. He agreed with them to pay them a denarius for a day's work. And God has told us what the reward will be, and we get to decide whether we're willing to accept it and do the work. Of course, if we understand what the promises are, what the reward is, we certainly would not turn it down. But he went again at different times throughout the day, told those that were willing to come work, and he'd pay them whatever was right. He didn't tell them how much he would pay them, but he just said whatever is right. And, if you trust God, but you don't really know what the reward is, you can still do the work and receive something good. As long as you trust the one who's paying the wages, they don't have to tell you how much they're paying you, because you trust them. You trust them to be fair. And God can certainly be trusted to be fair, in fact, more than fair. And when the evening had come, they start paying the workers from those that were hired last to the ones that were hired first. And I think this is a picture of the judgment day, but it's also a picture of how people are seeing how the payment is going to be made even now. The idea is that when the work is done, the pay will be given, but when the ones who are worked the shortest time get a denarius, that shows God being very generous in rewarding those who work for him. He didn't have to pay them a denarius. That's for a whole day's work, and they just worked an hour. But the ones that were hired first then thought, we'll receive more if those that worked just an hour got the denarius. And then they were upset when they got paid the same as the others. And there are people who believe they should receive more than what God has promised if there's those that have not done as much in the kingdom that receive the same promises that they do. Like, if I've worked longer in the kingdom than somebody else, why should I not get a greater reward? Of course, that's forgetting the fact that we're working for our own benefit. But anyway, in the parable, the landowner tells them he's not doing them any harm because what they received is what they had agreed on. And if God gives anyone what he promised, they really have nothing to complain about. He has a right to do what he wants with what belongs to him. That's what the man explained in the parable. And God does not let us tell him how to use what he has. He has a right to be generous, and we should be very thankful that he is, because we are the recipients of that generosity. And these workers should not have greed or envy because he's generous to others. But the problem comes in when we think we deserve more than others because we did more work. And that's just not how the kingdom works. That's not the kingdom. We should be grateful for God being generous, or none of us would receive any good. And we should not be upset if he's generous to others. It reminds me of the story of Jonah when he was upset that God was slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness towards the Ninevites, when he was glad that God was that way towards the Israelites. But in these parables, we find that it's easy to think that we deserve better than other people. If we believe that we deserve to be forgiven, but others don't deserve that, then we just don't understand God's forgiveness towards us. We can't possibly deserve his forgiveness. It's only by his mercy that he forgives. And so we should understand that others are just as deserving as we are, meaning they don't deserve it, but neither do we. And so if God will do that for the undeserving us, we should do it for the undeserving others. And if we think that we deserve a greater reward than others who are also working in the vineyard because we've been working longer, we don't understand that God doesn't need to hire us at all. He doesn't need us. We're looking forward to receiving his promises. And if the others receive those same promises, that's wonderful. That's a great thing, not a bad thing. And it's very probable that this parable, this last one that we looked at, is specifically dealing with the Jews being the ones who are working long in the vineyard and the Gentiles being the new ones coming in at the end of day. Or it could just be the idea of the religious people like the scribes and Pharisees looking at the sinners becoming part of the kingdom and seeing that they're receiving the same benefit and not liking that, as they've lived their life sinfully up till this point. But either way, the takeaway for us is the same. We must be grateful for what we receive, and we should want that for other people too. And that's what we should understand, is that if God deals with others the way that he deals with us, that's a good thing, because that means that we get to benefit from that too, and that God is able to do what he wants with what is his. And it's a wonderful thing for everyone. All right, well, that is the class for today. Thank you very much.